Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's overview webinar of the recently published report, Learning from Evaluations, a review of 16 midterm evaluations of USAID-funded food security development programs from 2015 to 2020. My name is Emily Marshall, and I'm the award manager on the Impel Award. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to quickly go through a few practical instructions for the webinar. First of all, we encourage everyone to please complete the poll you see on your screen and introduce yourselves in the chat box with your name and organization. We will be using the chat box for any communication not related to the content of the presentation. There, you can reach out to my colleague, Julia Randall, who can help you with any audio issues or other technical difficulties you have. In addition to the chat box, you will see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This is where we welcome you to post any questions you have related to today's presentation, and please feel free to post anytime throughout the session. Our presenters will answer your questions during the Q&A session after the presentation. If we cannot answer all the questions in the allotted time, we will prepare a frequently asked questions document to share with participants after the webinar. And finally, we will be sharing the PowerPoint slides and the recording of this webinar with all registrants after it ends. We are joined today by Arif Rashid, Acting Chief of the DMEAL Division at the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And Arif will provide a brief background and introduce this work. Over to you, Arif.
Good morning, and thank you, Emily. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of the participants in this webinar. I would like to welcome all of you. This is a very interesting and exciting discussion. For those of you who are familiar with DIPSAs, or Development Food Security Activities, that we used to call, now we call them Resilience and Food Security Activities, or RIFSAs. In 2013, then Food for Peace, and now transformed into BHA, commissioned a study called Food Aid and Food Security Assessment 2. And that study, one of their recommendations was that BHA should improve BHA should use innovative approaches to improve the quality and rigor of midterm evaluation of these RIFSAs. For those of you who don't know much about those RIFSAs, these are multi-sectoral, integrated, large food security program. Typically, the lifespan is for 5 years. And so in 2015, BHA has been trying new approaches to do midterm evaluation, as I said, that to improve the quality and rigor. And all of these midterm evaluations since 2015 were jointly conducted. When I say jointly conducted, meaning it includes BHA staff, it includes our implementing partner staff, it includes mission staff, and also it includes consultants in some cases. Many of those evaluations were led by BHA, but also there were many evaluations that were led by consultants hired by our implementing partner. And this implementer-led evaluation and learning, Impel, they decided to look at the evaluations. There are 16 evaluations, midterm evaluations, to look at the recommendations of these evaluations to identify patterns, to identify what are some of the common recommendations, so that we can look at them and take action so that we can address the challenges that are identified in those 16 evaluations identified by the evaluation team. So this is, as I said, this is a very timely and exciting webinar. With that, I would like to hand over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Arif, for that introduction. I'll now hand it over to Tom Spangler, the project director for Impel. Tom will review the poll results and will also be the moderator for today's Q&A session. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Emily and Arif. And again, we want to thank everyone that's joined us today. My name is Tom Spangler, and I do work for Save the Children on the Implementer-Led Evaluation and Learning Award. And before we dive into the presentation of findings today, we thought it would be a good idea to get a better sense of who's participating in today's webinar. So based on the results from the online poll that many of you have filled in, we see that as expected, we have many participants, the majority joining from North America, but we're also very encouraged to see many joining us from the field as well. Not surprisingly, we have a good bit of participants from East Africa and Central and Southern Africa. One would expect that given the target areas for DIFSA programming, but fortunately, we also have participants from Asia and Europe as well. Unfortunately, I see that no one's been able to join us from Oceania, but maybe better luck next time. I think more importantly, in terms of your own background, we realize that many of us involved in this field wear different hats at different times, but we can also see that we have participation from senior management of implementing partners, certainly activity management. The highest category of participants are those representing technical support, primarily from the headquarters or regional levels for implementing partners. We're also very glad to have USAID activity management and technical support with us today, as well as they'll be able to obviously give important contributions to the conversation. Finally, we wanted to see how many of you have actually participated in these midterm evaluations. And I think we have a very good balance there as well. While many have not, 60% have not, that provides a really good opportunity for us to share some of the learning from these today. And then we'll look to those of you who have participated, that 40% who have participated, to share your own insights and learning from these activities. So again, thank you very much for filling out that poll. And with that, let's get right to it. I'll now hand it back to Emily and Tim Ogborn, the consultant who carried out the review, to lead us through a summary of his findings.
Thank you so much, Tom. And over to you, Tim, for the presentation.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. It's wonderful to be here. Many of you know me. I was looking through the participant list and I see a lot of friends. I'm a consultant. I used to work for a number of the implementing partners represented in this list of midterm reviews that I've reviewed. And so I'm excited to be able to present some of the findings from read the whole report. It's not that long. And if you can't manage that, at least the executive, you should get a little bit more out of that than I have time to present here. I won't repeat what Arif said about the midterm reports and DIFSAs and how these were implemented, only to say that this is the list of reports that were reviewed. Some of them were termed midterm evaluations, others were midterm reviews. I will reference them throughout this as MTEs, short for midterm evaluations. The countries that we did reviews for were Bangladesh, DRC, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Haiti, Madagascar, and Malawi. And you can see the list of all the specific DIFSAs or DFAPs that were included in this high-level review. The review, first of all, did a high-level quantitative assessment of all the recommendations made in the MTEs and categorized them against a set of different themes and sub-themes. And then secondly, a qualitative review explored the content of the recommendations in more detail and specifically identified certain themes or trends that seem to be coming up repeatedly across the whole set of MTEs. There were 4 MTEs that had no specific gender youth recommendations. This was because those reviews weren't able to find a gender or youth specialist to participate. So just to mention that. Also, the nature of the recommendations varied significantly between the different MTEs. Some MTEs focused very much on specific recommendations, suggested detailed changes to individual interventions, such as adjusting a training to include some missing item. Other reports tended towards more high-level, broad, more strategic recommendations, and tended not to focus at that more detailed level. This variation in style did mean that sometimes we were comparing recommendations that were sometimes like comparing apples and oranges. But despite that, I think we come to a fairly good assessment of what were the common trends, et cetera, across these different MTEs. First, I'll speak a little bit about the quantitative review. The assessments were, the categorizations, the reviews were categorized against a set of major major themes. Let me just move something out of the way here. The major technical themes, cross-cutting themes, management operations, type of recommendation, and miscellaneous. So let me say a little bit about the type of recommendation. I could have included this in cross-cutting themes, but I felt this was slightly different in that these were recommendations around training of participants, research, community accountability, strategy, which was slightly different, I felt, in context to cross-cutting themes, which were sustainability and exit, gender, women's empowerment, etc. I won't go through all the specific categories, but you can see them there, and they're included with specific definitions in the report. The technical themes were also subdivided into 5 sub-themes: household access to food, reduction of malnutrition, disaster risk management, national safety nets, and then a catch-all for other technical areas that didn't come up enough to warrant a theme on their own: literacy, NRM, conflict mitigation, climate change, and community WASH. And it's important to recognize that I didn't set out to put together a framework for food security. These themes and sub-themes and categories were generated from the recommendations. So they represent what I found within the recommendations. Also, virtually all the recommendations were multifaceted. They didn't just address one theme or sub-theme or one category. And so each recommendation generated a reference against multiple ones of these categories and consequently themes or sub-themes. For example, recommendations such as the project should consider stopping the lead farmer approach to training farmers, which has not been effective at getting farmers to adopt new production practices, and learn about and adopt the farmer field school approach implemented by the other DFSA, which has been more successful in promoting improved practices. This may require training of staff and community volunteers in the new approach and the reallocation of staff to effectively implement farmer field schools. So a recommendation like that would generate multiple entries for the following categories: agricultural production, agricultural extension, learning, linkages, intervention design, capacity building of community volunteers, staff training, and project management. So you'll see that there are many, many more references that emerge from these recommendations than there were specific recommendations themselves. We reviewed 16 MTEs covering 7 countries through the years from 2015 to 2019. The MTEs contained 743 separate recommendations, which generated 3,032 references to the categories that were in the table in the previous slide. The number of recommendations per MTE varied from a low of 20 for the Ubali review, and those 20 tended more towards the higher level strategic type of recommendation I mentioned, to a high of 74 recommendations for the Sega-Mill review, which tended towards a more detailed type of review that I mentioned. And there was an average of 48 recommendations per MTE. So this pie chart shows how the recommendations were distributed across the major and subsidiary themes. Technical themes, not surprisingly, generated the most references at 33%. 30% of the references related to the type of recommendation being made. And management and operations and cross-cutting themes each made up about 1/6 of the references. Miscellaneous or uncategorized references make up less than 1%, which I think indicates that we captured the majority of the references within these main themes. When we look at the subsidiary themes under the technical area, not surprisingly, reduction of malnutrition, household access to food generated the most references, 13% each, with other and DRM 3% each, and national safety nets 1%. So I think this gives a representation of the types of areas that these recommendations were focused on. So this slide shows the highest occurring categories by number and percentage of recommendations. And in particular, these were all the categories that had over 50 references from the recommendations. Again, there's not too many surprises. We implement our DIFSs basically through specific interventions. And if we're wanting to improve the work we do, it's not surprising that intervention design recommendations to improve or change design comes out top with nearly 50% of the references. Training of participants comes next. Again, not much of a surprise, and clearly project management is integral to being able to implement effectively, and that came in third. And then three of our major technical areas, agricultural production, nutrition, and MCH, RMNCH came in fourth, fifth, and sixth. Okay, if we move to the lowest occurring categories, this were 10 or less references. I'm just going to comment on 3 areas I thought was quite surprising. Theory of change only had 5 references, and really since 2015, I think it's been the key planning mechanism that we've been using in these DIFSs. And so I would have thought there might have been more references to adapting or changing or updating the theory of change. Impacting indirect participants, BHA intends on achieving change at that population level. And it seems surprising to me that there were not more references to how we could reach the whole population rather than just the target groups. And the other area that was I was surprised to find here was vulnerability targeting. We're attempting to reach the most vulnerable through these programs. And that's always been a difficulty to achieve. And again, there weren't so many references to reaching the most vulnerable, which was a bit of a surprise to me. Moving on to the qualitative analysis, which is really where the focus of this evaluation was supposed to be. And again, these are just picking up on trends that I saw through all of the evaluations. The process of doing this was I reviewed all of the recommendations, and from the perspective of just reviewing them, I noted down those recommendations that seem to repeat themselves time and time again through the MTEs. Most consistently was this area of too many interventions. There was way too many interventions from the perspective of the reviewers, and recommendations focused on narrowing down the number of interventions to those that had the best chance of sustainability, reducing the interventions such that the workload of community volunteers and of staff was brought to a level that could be could be managed by those volunteers. I think we're all aware, in particular for women, the number of committees and trainings and so on they have to attend. The next area was the quality of the activity interventions. There was a significant mention around low quality of SBC approaches. Sometimes this was about the design of the approaches, sometimes it was about the implementation of the approaches. And a key issue was often a lack of understanding of the SBC methodologies amongst the frontline staff, and consequence poor implementation and inconsistent design. And this, for those who are familiar with the FANTA SBC assessment that was done a few years ago, very consistent with the findings of that report. Again, low quality of training provided to partners, a lack of knowledge of adult learning methodologies among staff and consequently community volunteers, and a need to more consistently train and more effectively train staff and community volunteers in such methods. There was a sense that training courses were done once, and then there was an expectation that participants would be able to, community volunteers would be able to then just carry out the training effectively with the other beneficiaries that they were focused on. But we all know that training, one-off trainings don't work. You need to have follow-up, you need mentorship, you need refresher trainings. And again, related to the too many interventions, there was there wasn't the possibility to carry out the refresher training courses and the mentorship, etc., that quality programming would be needs to have. There was insufficient focus on the quality and appropriateness of promoted technologies, especially in agriculture. Sometimes promoted technologies weren't the most appropriate for the situation, and in other cases, even when they were appropriate, there wasn't a focus on the quality of implementation that was required to actually have the impact sought. And that led to the non-adoption of promoted technologies, especially in agriculture. There was inadequate tailoring of support packages for target groups. While many of the DIFSs had specific focus on recognizing the differences between the needs of, for instance, youth, pregnant lactating women, the poorest, etc., these had designed programs to develop different packages for the different target groups. On the implementation side, that often didn't happen. Sustainability. BHA has put a strong emphasis on sustainability for many years, in particular, requiring plans that systematically and explicitly address the 4 key factors for sustainability identified in the FANTA Sustainability and Exit Strategies report. What the recommendations indicated, however, was that a fair number of the DIFSs didn't have sustainability plans, and even when they did, many of the staff hadn't read them or were unaware of their existence, and so weren't able to implement them effectively. There was concerns about developing dependency and entitlement mentality among the beneficiaries through the many handouts that the DIFSs and DFATs provide, such as free seeds, agricultural tools, etc. Excuse me. The recommendations had a significant focus on development of private sector fee-for-service models of service delivery, as these were considered to be potentially more sustainable once the activity ended, as compared to public sector extension services, where they felt they were unlikely to be sustainable once the resources of the DFATs were removed from supporting the government extension services. Though were many recommendations that questioned the ability to maintain the motivation of volunteers once the activity had ended. There was a series of recommendations addressing the difficulty of reaching or servicing remote areas effectively. Obviously, remoteness is a clear contributing factor to vulnerability. So the being able to reach or implement effective programming in remote areas was a key issue for many DIFSAs, and clearly most of the DIFSAs were having problems in that area. There was a set of recommendations about collaboration and learning. In particular, recommendations suggesting greater collaboration and sharing of approaches, manuals, etc., between DFAPs and DIFSAs in the same country. Usually the DFAPs and DIFSAs are not operating in the same geographic area or even contiguous areas, but there was a feeling that with greater collaboration, we could leverage the resources being invested through the sharing of different approaches, and manuals, etc. Similar with the above bullet, there was a significant number of recommendations in the MTEs about increasing collaboration with other donor-funded projects that were operating in the same area. And we know that this has become increasingly an important strategy of USAID in one of its projects. And there was a couple of miscellaneous cross-cutting ones. One was about recommendations about the need for layering and integration of different activity interventions at the household level, where clearly DIFSAs were having problems at effectively delivering their programming to households, addressing the multifaceted issues around food security. And while BHA has always done significant population-based baseline studies, often there was a lack of knowledge of these studies and also a lack of the use of the baseline data by many of the DIFSA staff, DIFSAs represented in this report. Sector-specific trends, agriculture and livelihoods, they were the largest, that was the largest area of recommendations that came through the quantitative assessment. So you'd imagine there might be the largest number of themes and trends. However, I think due to the context-specific nature of many agricultural production systems, there weren't that many consistent themes or trends apart from the cross-cutting ones that emerged from these reviews. The three that did emerge was recommendations that indicated there were big issues in actually developing income-generating interventions, in particular for youth and women, and supporting entrepreneurship in these very remote areas. Village Savings and Loans Associations, VSLAs, universally viewed as successful and sustainable, and there were many recommendations that spoke to how to leverage the success of the VSLAs to achieve broader impact from the activity. And at a sort of more micro level, access to quality livestock feeds seems to be a problem across many of the MTEs, and we had many recommendations speaking to that. In the health and nutrition area, there are many more consistent trends. I think this probably speaks to the common use of the 1,000-day approach and care groups, etc. A key issue here was it seemed from the recommendations that the diverse set of interventions that goes into the 1,000-day approach, target food distribution to PLWs, care group messaging, growth monitoring, cooking classes, kitchen gardens, etc., which form a coherent, integrated strategy focused on reducing childhood malnutrition. There seemed to be a significant lack of understanding of this coherent approach amongst both participants and sometimes staff, where these activities or these interventions were viewed as just separate activities that benefited the participants, but didn't really hold together as a program of activities specifically focused on childhood malnutrition. Recommendations indicated that community members were often unclear that the purpose of the nutrition, food and cash transfers was specifically to address malnutrition nutrition needs of pregnant lactating women and children under 2, and that they were often treated in the same way as emergency food distribution distributions, and they were just really to address food problems within families. Moving on, those recommendations speaking to the need to strengthen the training of nutrition promoters, lead mothers, and community health volunteers. And I think this speaks back to that cross-cutting issue of the quality of training and follow-up and refresher trainings and so on. The sets of recommendations recommending increasing the supervision of community nutrition and health volunteers. The recommendations also indicated that there was lack of clarity around the purpose of anthropometric measurement and the capacity of people to actually carry out anthropometric measurement. So if you don't know why you're doing a measurement and you're not very good at it, that begs the question as to the quality of the outputs from that intervention. There were recommendations about improving the quality of home visits, and in some of the more recent MTEs, there were recommendations about moving from food distribution to cash voucher transfers. And again, at the more specific level, many of these MTEs had kitchen garden, keyhole garden type activities, and provided seeds to the participants. And there was an issue with how to maintain the distribution of quality seeds after the activity ended. Water, sanitation, hygiene. There was a lot of recommendations indicating that there was insufficient understanding about water management financing issues, specifically related to the setting of user fees and the ability to raise financing to maintain the water installations. Water quality testing was a recommendation that came up quite consistently, the need to ensure that water points had quality water and how to maintain that testing. Related to the SBC issues mentioned earlier, the uptake of improved wash practices could be improved significantly, and there was a lot of recommendations about how that could be done more effectively. And then there was a range of recommendations that indicated there were problems with latrines, including the cost and quality of construction and ongoing maintenance. As I mentioned, youth and gender, 4 of the DIFSs had no specific youth and gender recommendations, but the ones that did seem to come through indicated that youth were not being reached effectively by the activities, in particular with respect to youth livelihoods interventions. On the gender side, I got the strong sense that in more recent DIFSs, these were less an issue because of the more robust recommendations and systematic guidance that we find in the RFAs these days. But gender was often viewed by DFAPs as an area addressed in silos of gender groups, women's and men's groups, etc., rather than being integrated into and across all the interventions. And recommendations indicating that gender integration is more than just collecting gender disaggregated data, which seemed to be, at least in the earlier DIFSs, the key gender strategy. Okay, nearly coming to the end. Monitoring, evaluation, analysis, and learning. Major area is indicated here was there too many indicators to be collected. You have the whole range of USAID indicators plus the other indicators that most implementing partners added to the USAID required indicators, generating vast amounts of data, leading in many ways to much of the rest of these recommendations. The meal systems that were functioning, they didn't serve the learning agendas and adaptive management requirements of the projects. They generally generated data for reporting primarily back to BHA, and didn't provide or weren't analyzed in a way that helped adaptive management. Related to that is that many of the data management systems were taking too long to become functional. Often they still weren't functioning at the time of the MTEs, when the MTEs took place halfway through the program. So clearly weren't in a place to be able to provide data for improved data management. A whole range of recommendations indicated that there was inadequate data quality. These are actually two separate bullet points. I apologize that they end up as one bullet. The range of data of indicators that needed to be collecting them on paper-based systems and then inputting them into the data management systems, often a year or two after they were collected because of delays in the data management system. All of these led to problems with the data quality that was in the meal systems. There was a lack of knowledge of qualitative M&E methodologies. And this relates to the last bullet, the lack of monitoring of program implementation quality. If you're really wanting to have strong learning agendas and to have adaptive management that enables you to reorient the programs, the activities programming on an ongoing basis, you need to be able to understand the quality of what you're implementing, not just that there are 254 people were trained in the month of January. You want to know what the quality of that training and what people did with that training. Finally, a number of miscellaneous pieces. The quality and quantity of food or cash for assets interventions was often poor. Either they were poorly designed, or when they had a good design for the road or water management structure, they were sometimes poorly implemented. There were recommendations about the need to strengthen community level governance, both in relation to the groups supported by the activities, water management committees, for instance, or community level planning coordination committees, and strengthening the governance of those committees, but also around recommendations for the capacity of community groups to hold government agencies to account. And for the more recent activities implemented under the R&I process, the recommendations indicated that the number of research activities should be reduced to those critical for refining activity design and implementation plan. And I think that's get through all of the recommendations from the report. I hope that you've been able to put your questions in the Q&A tab, and I will hand over to Tom, who's been looking through the questions, to moderate a Q&A session where I believe he'll be asking myself and Arif and any others who happen to be online any questions that people may have. So Tom, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks to each of you who've entered questions and comments. It's obvious they're all very substantive and based on your experience with these types of programs and evaluations, so very much appreciate that. And we're going to have limited time to cover all of these, but we'll try to get a representative sample of some of the questions that have been asked. I think the first is just general with regard to methodology from Amit, and then there was another from Tom. In questioning what criteria was used to select these DIFSAs for inclusion in the review, and my understanding is the review primarily included each of those evaluations that have followed this joint methodology since 2015 that Food for Peace, now BHA, is supporting. that includes participants. They're very participatory evaluations that include representatives of both implementing partners and USAID, both at the headquarters and field levels. So this is fairly inclusive of all of those since 2015. Amit, Tom asked the question, how was comparability across midterm evaluations handled in your review, Tim?
I did not review the methodological approaches of the different MTEs. In as much as I have any assessment of that, they tended to follow a somewhat similar methodology of using semi-structured interviews and focus group approaches to generate information out of community participants, and then assessment of whatever data was generated out of the M&E systems. But I didn't look at that in any specific detail. So the comparability of the data that emerged is hard to speak to, because I didn't really assess the methodology, except that the methodologies did seem to follow a fairly similar approach. I did mention that some of the recommendations were at the very high strategic level, and other MTEs tended to have a multitude of recommendations, much more at the sort of intervention level. So those types, the differences between those types of recommendations, they weren't very comparable. And so that did create issues around the data that I collected. But in general, I felt that there was, even when I was looking at the more strategic level and comparing them with some of the more detailed level entities, I tried to get to the essence of what the recommendations were about, so that I could better represent that common theme in the report. But there were issues of comparability, and basically I used my best judgment to try and address that in my assessment. Tom.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Tim, for that. Next question that I'll pose here is related to sustainability and prioritization. We know this is a very common challenge, one that we've all been working on, and one that we're all interested in getting more insight to from this review. So the question is from Tom with Mercy Corps. Why would narrowing down interventions to those with greatest probability of sustainability be such a frequent theme? Shouldn't it be a blend of highest impact and sustainability?
I think that's a good question, and I'm not going to answer it because you're asking me to put an opinion, my opinion on the recommendations. And my purpose was to generate data that hopefully will generate discussions around that very question you've just asked. I personally think it's a very, it's an excellent question, and I have some personal opinions on it, but I don't think that's really my role right now. I don't know if Arif might want to speak to that from a BHA perspective.
No, thank you, Tim. Yes, that's a very, very valid question. From our perspective, yes, both of them are important. But if an activity produces an outcome which is not going to be sustainable, the outcome will diminishes with the end of the project, then the value of that particular outcome is far less compared to another outcome which has likelihood to sustain longer time even after the end of the activity. So yes, producing outcome, the intervention that can generate highest quality outcome and sustainability are important, but and they are not mutually exclusive. But in this particular case, the focus was more on sustainability because many of the intervention, and from my experience with not only BHA, but in my my previous engagement with other donor funded activities, the sustainability has been a major challenge. While many activities were able to produce impactful outcome. Over.
Great. Thank you very much, Arif. Tim, you in your review also found out that in general, VSLA were found to be a very effective approach for achieving sustainable outcomes. We had a question from Nancy that asks, in addition to VSLA, were there other components that consistently performed across projects or context-dependent components? What is being learned about universal and context-dependent design strategies? Arif, could you give us your perspective on this question?
Thank you, Tom and Nancy for this question. I think most of these or all of these midterm evaluations or reviews, they found VSLA is either it has all the elements to be sustainable. So that's definitely one common area or intervention. The other, intervention which we found are likely to be sustainable, or because again, you need to look at that these are midterm evaluation, which was done in the middle of the life of an activity, which is 2.5 years into the activity's life. And as we know, the first year goes to set up the activity, set up management, hiring staff, and with the refine and implement approach, like refining the theory of change and whatnot. So it's basically, realistically, it's 1.5 years into the activity's life. So in that time, based on the factors that contributes to sustainability, which one is definitely we saw, or many midterm evaluations saw that the VSLA. The other one we saw is market-based intervention that are related to either they're like, aggregating commodities and selling as a group to the market, which has, again, that has a market-based approach, meaning the people who they have a financial motivation to do that. We found that has that is likely to sustain if they are done right. The other thing that we saw that are likely to sustain, again, it's all about the motivation, the financial motivation that was created by the activity. Another activity that we saw, which at least the evaluation team found that they are likely to be sustainable, is that the private service provider approach. Many of our partners started to invest on private service provider who are locally identified, probably one, project participant, they're locally identified, and then the activity has been investing to develop their capacity, building linkages with the market. We also found that they are likely to sustain. Again, as you say, that they are context specific. So it is difficult to generalize them across the board. But VSLA is definitely, we were able to generalize that they are likely to sustain if they're done right. Over.
Could I just add to that, within the context of this review, most of the evaluations had a brief section on what was going well, and it tended to be a brief section, a paragraph, and then analyses of where improvements could take place and a range of recommendations. This was a review of the recommendations. So by definition, it focused on the areas where improvements could take place rather than on where things were going well. So there were I did not do an analysis of trends of where things were going well. But what was interesting is that really the two areas that, one area where things were going very well were the VSLAs, and the the essence of the recommendations around the VSLAs was how the success of the VSLAs could be leveraged to produce greater impact in some of the other areas, whether it's entrepreneurship, whether it's on market-based sales of products, et cetera. Arif did mention the focus on private sector service providers, which did come out of the evaluation, but the recommendation there was less, this is going really well, that therefore continue doing it, but more the essence, the focus up until then had been more on the public sector extension services, which were considered to be less sustainable, and recommendations to the projects to look at perhaps some of the private sector models that Arif was referencing then. So the evaluation, the review itself was not focused on looking at what was going well, but was focused on what was in the recommendations, which generally looked at what was reflected on what the reviewers felt wasn't going so well. Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. In the interest of time, I'm going to move it to, I think, an inclusive question that'll be really good for us to hear input on in terms of the way forward. We have several good questions on more specific issues related to SBC, theory of change, and WASH, and unfortunately, we won't be able to field all of those today, but we will provide follow-up input to those, and we'll explain how in just a moment. I think the last question I'd like to pose to you, Arif, is an all-inclusive one, but very important to get your perspective on. What does BHA take away from this? How might future RFAs be adjusted to incorporate the results of this review? And what might be the high-level substantive changes in design guidance?
Thank you, Tom. So that's a great question. I think I can talk about like what I know from BHA side, that we all, like BHA and the implementing partners, we are all together in this journey. So we all have the same objective. How can we achieve the outcome that we intended to achieve as we designed and implemented these activities? So there will be, as Tom indicated, that there will be follow-on sessions, not today, but coming soon, where we like to discuss, we like to challenge ourselves, right? We meaning all of us who are together in this journey, we like to challenge ourselves to think about what each of us who are the players of this, who are responsible to design, implement, developing RFA, what can we do to address these challenges? So if there are things that BHA can do in terms of developing RFA, then BHA will do, we will make those efforts to make those changes. But there might be things that also implementing partners or potential future applicants can do. So whether they can do those. So there will be, we would like to challenge ourselves in some of the future sessions where we like to dissect these recommendations a little bit more to understand what are the systemic challenges that each of these organizations like BHA, implementing partner, mission, what are the systemic challenges that we all face, and what can we do collectively to address those issues? Over.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Arif. Unfortunately, we're getting very close to time, so we won't pose more questions at this point, but we definitely appreciate your interest in the summary of the midterm review, the Food for Peace funded DFAPs and DIFSAs, and of course, all of the great questions that you posed. And again, I want to say on behalf of Impel that we're very happy to facilitate this ongoing conversation between BHA and implementing partners. And we'll keep working with the IDEAL Award and others to ensure that the lessons learned are applied to the design, implementation, and monitoring of future activities. We will be sharing a recording in today's webinar, and we'll post a copy of Tim's presentation on the recently refreshed FSN Network website. And we'll also be posting the frequently asked questions about the MTE review itself, and the response to those questions that we weren't able to get to during today's webinar. So definitely we encourage you to share these resources along with the report itself with any of your colleagues who may be interested but were unable to join us today. And in the meantime, we ask that you take just a few short minutes to complete the brief evaluation of today's event at the link provided. Your feedback will be very helpful for us to ensure that future events like this one are informative, interactive, and useful for all of those in the broader BHA community. I'll hand it back to Emily.
Thank you so much, Tom. Please do fill out our event evaluation here, and we'll follow up with everyone shortly with an email including the FAQ document that we've mentioned, the recording, and the slides. Thank you.